So my presentation is on the requirements, in particular the data requirements of cross-domain use cases for IoT-enabled smart cities. And I explain all of those elements as we go along. I am from Climate Associates, but I'm a partner in the Horizon 2020 Vicinity IoT project, which I'll also explain a little bit more about. And I'm also representing the Alliance for Internet of Things Innovation, in particular Working Group 8 on smart cities. Okay, next one. What's happened to that? It's gone. That's it. I have to press it twice. Okay, so here's an outline of my talk. I will just do 2 slides on the vicinity architecture and data management. I won't go into the technical details there. Explain a little bit about the AIoT, Alliance for Innovation, Alliance for Internet of Things Innovation. Look at the sources of best practices in cross-domain use cases for smart cities. Identify a list of representative ones and focus on the 3 which have the most implications for personal data usage. And then ask some key questions for perhaps the other speakers to answer. Okay, so there's the high-level logical architecture. Don't worry about the details. The important thing is this dashed line here, because underneath there is a peer-to-peer network of vicinity nodes. So it is simply acting as a communications device for IoT infrastructures to communicate with each other. And the data management is such that it doesn't store any personal data within the vicinity cloud or the vicinity servers itself. All it does is store the metadata that enables the other IoT infrastructures and endpoints to communicate with each other and to translate between the different types of IoT infrastructure. Now the question, of course, is metadata covered by the GDPR, and is this addressing it in the most appropriate way? How many of you are familiar with the GDPR? Most of you, yes, I thought that might be the case. And how many of you are familiar with the draft e-privacy regulation? Not so many, but that will come into force probably next year, although they're still arguing about the details. But that's quite an interesting spin-off from the GDPR as well. Okay, so a little bit about the Alliance for Internet of Things Innovation. It was originally a European-focused activity to promote cooperation in IoT globally. It was kicked off by the European Commission, but it's now been transformed into a private entity in its own right. How many of you are familiar with AOTI? Okay, not so many. Okay. 13 working groups, both horizontal and vertical. The horizontal working groups are looking at things like policy, research, standards, etc. And the vertical working groups are looking at specific verticals such as energy, smart cities, wearables, etc. And I'm particularly involved with the Working Group 8 on smart cities, which is looking at specifically replication techniques for smart city solutions. So we can take a solution that's worked in one city and try and apply it to others. Okay. The next element of the puzzle here is what is cross-domain, because I said I was looking specifically at cross-domain use cases. And cross-domain use cases are what I think of as the most interesting ones, because they take data which is currently present in different silos and try and use data from those silos to create new services and new added value for cities. So for example, you might have data that's currently present, say, in the smart travel area, and try and relate that to the smart lighting or the e-waste area. And you might come up with different relationships there which add value. The problem, of course, is that exposes the privacy concerns of the personal data even more, because the more you sort of mash this data together, the more it makes it possible to identify individuals within that data. And so there are particular privacy concerns there. Okay, where can we find best practices for cross-domain use cases? Well, a very good source is the Horizon 2020 Lighthouse projects. These are projects which are typically tens of millions of euros in funding each. And there's currently, I think it's about 12 of these that have been kicked off over the last 3 or 4 years. And they're looking at a huge range of issues from smart mobility in cities through to waste management, through to building energy efficiency, for example. And they're a good source of use cases. Even more so will be the Horizon 2020 large-scale projects, pilots rather. These are typically hundreds of millions of euros each. And there's something like 50,000 different sensors and devices involved or being deployed here. So it's rolling out IoT on a large scale. So for example, the Monica project is on wearables, and there's something like 10,000 devices which are being deployed, wearable devices, which all have to be tracked and communicate with each other and between themselves and servers, etc. The ActiveAge project is going to link about 20,000 different sensors and devices in users' homes, for example, to allow them to live in homes for longer so they don't have to move into care homes. And this is a massive undertaking which will generate quite a lot of use cases in its own right. Okay, so in IoT Working Group 8, I've been looking specifically at what are the representative cross-domain use cases in smart cities. And I've come up with 8 generic ones. These range from, probably the simplest, and is deployed in most cities, is smart lighting, for example, that can be turned on and off or dim depending on the traffic levels, depending on the safety implications and all of that sort of thing. And this has the potential to save a lot of energy and is being deployed in many cities worldwide. The 3 that I'll focus on specifically here, though, are the air quality one, the e-health and assisted living one, and the mobility inside the city use case, because these have the most implications for personal data as such. Okay, so don't worry about the details here. What I want you to do is focus on the red arrow on the top left, because basically, at the moment, it will be very useful to have an idea in cities of where the poor air quality areas are, where the good air quality areas are. And take a city like London. It has a huge problem with air quality at the moment, and it's failed to meet the European Air Quality Directive for about 5 years in a row, or something like that, or even more possibly by now. And so there's a huge initiative to try and improve air quality in London. Now the trouble is, you only have probably about 100 air quality sensors across the whole of London at the moment, and it clearly isn't enough. So this use case is about trying to increase the number of air quality sensors by building them in, well, not building them into the smartphone itself, but linking them to smartphones, which then transmit the information on a regular basis into a site like the London Air Quality Network. And this will allow, eventually, traffic to be routed into areas or routes which have better air quality rather than poorer air quality, so you can even out the air quality a bit better. Really, it's trying to reduce the peaks of poor air quality, okay? But what information has to travel across that interface? Clearly not just the air quality information, but you also need location information. So you're effectively tracking a user's smartphone and the air quality and the location that it's going across, and that has implications for personal data. On to assisted living and e-health. This example is taken from the Vicinity Horizon 2020 project, and it's looking at how to allow people to stay in their homes for longer. What infrastructure do you need to put in place to allow an elderly or a disabled person to to actually reside in their home rather than having to be moved into a specialized facility or care home. And the sort of information that we're looking at is things like location sensors for where they are in the home. This is an extension, this is an active age use case which looks at their mobility outside the home as well. So it's tracking them within boundaries and where they are outside the home, and feeding this into central databases that municipalities or private care providers hold. And the sort of data sources that you have for this are things like wearable GPS positioning devices, panic buttons, mats on the floor which identify where they are. For example, smart appliances like smart ovens which can tell the central server if the oven has been left on, for example. You can monitor whether the person has got out of bed in the morning, whether they've had interaction with other residents or outside the home. You can identify a lot of things to do with this person's quality of life simply by setting up this infrastructure and monitoring them. But of course, that's all very personal data. And at the moment, the municipalities and the private health providers, obviously they just ask the user to sign a consent form, which they assume then allows them to access any of this personal data. But of course there must be safeguards on how that personal data is then used and who it's made available to. Okay? The final use case that I'm going to cover is mobility inside the city. And again, this relies on a user smartphone or other device to actually be online all the time, to be able to communicate information on where the user goes, and where they travel, where they stop, etc., in order to improve the infrastructure within a city. So if you want to know where the bottlenecks are within a city, you have continuous online access to user movements. And clearly that has huge personal data implications as well. So for example, the sort of data sources here are mainly based around the personal smartphone. So you have constant localization of the personal device. So this is a form of metadata. You can identify the places visited, the frequency, how long they spend there, the time taken to move around the city, because that's what's trying to be optimized, the distance traveled, and clearly that personal data should be encrypted, so it's not available to anybody, and it should be anonymized, certainly. So you can't then identify the actual personal user from that data. And it should certainly not be possible to put all this data together to identify individuals. So anonymization is clearly a good way of doing this if you can do anonymization effectively. But there are techniques for doing this. But how many of you have heard of pseudonymization? Okay. A few of you. Well, this is like anonymization, but there is a separate database held, which means that you can actually go and identify the individual by going to the separate database. Okay? And clearly there must be strict rules as to who and how you can access that personal database, who is the data controller, and whether the purpose that you've identified to require access to that database is justified. And it's very much based on a risk assessment whereby you have to justify the need to identify the individuals in that personal database so that you can match the personal data to the individuals. Key questions, finally. So is it acceptable to use personal data that's collected for the purposes I've described in these use cases? Should all users providing their personal data give their consent to their data being used for this purpose? Now the problem is there could be many, many consents required from users who don't even know that their data is being used. Should they know? Is it going to lead to consent fatigue? If they do have to provide their consent in all these different situations, is it practical? Thirdly, is it actually possible to anonymize data effectively, or will you have systems that can break this anonymization in the end? Or is pseudonymization sufficient? And what are the safeguards to allow pseudonymization to be used effectively? And I'm hoping that some of my fellow speakers may answer or approach some of these questions. And that's a list of references that you can follow up from this presentation. Thank you.